The interview suit felt heavier than it should have, like it carried every unpaid bill, every sleepless night, every quiet prayer Jacob had whispered into the dark. He stood outside the glass doors of Hartwell Technologies, with a folder clutched to his chest, watching his own reflection tremble in the polished surface. This was the kind of place where dreams got approved or denied in a single handshake. This was the job that could pull his mother out of a leaking apartment and finally give them a life that didn't feel like survival. And then, in one brutal instant, everything changed, because a girl stumbled into the street, crying, and Jacob ran toward her instead of his future. If you believe in kindness and second chances, take a second right now to like this video, comment, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this remind us what kind of people we want to be. It was early spring in Chicago, the kind of morning where the air still bit at your skin but the sun tried its best to warm the city anyway. Jacob had arrived nearly an hour early because he couldn't risk the train being late, couldn't risk anything. He had practiced answers in the mirror for days, repeating them until his voice stopped shaking. He was 24, the kind of young man who had learned to be strong without ever being taught how. His father had left when Jacob was a teenager, leaving behind silence, debt, and a mother named Margaret whose health had slowly weakened from working too many years in too many jobs. Jacob had been the one to take over, to become the man of the house before he even knew what that meant. He worked nights at a warehouse and mornings delivering groceries, saving every extra dollar like it was oxygen. Hartwell Technologies had posted an entry-level analyst role with growth opportunities and benefits, and Jacob had stared at the listing like it was a miracle. He applied with shaking hands, not expecting anything, but somehow, he got the interview. That morning, he wore a second-hand charcoal suit that didn't fit perfectly but looked respectable. He carried a resume printed on thick paper he could barely afford. He'd even shined his shoes using a rag and leftover polish from a neighbor. Everything in him was focused on one thing: do not mess this up. He crossed the street toward the building when he noticed the girl. She was sitting on the curb near a bus stop, hugging her knees, her hair tangled by the wind, her cheeks wet with tears. She couldn't have been more than 16 or 17. At first, Jacob assumed she was just another teenager having a bad morning, but then he saw her hands shaking, her breathing too fast, like she was fighting to stay above water. She kept looking over her shoulder as if she expected someone to come after her. Her backpack was half open, and a phone lay in the gutter beside her like it had been dropped without thought. Jacob hesitated. His eyes flicked to his watch. 20 minutes. The lobby doors were right there. The security guard inside would check him in. The recruiter would call his name. This was it. But the girl made a sound, half sob, half gasp, that didn't belong to a normal bad day. It sounded like fear. Jacob stepped toward her anyway, his heart thudding with that old instinct he'd never been able to silence, the one that told him to protect people even when no one had protected him. He crouched a few feet away, careful not to scare her. He asked if she was okay, if she was hurt, if she needed help. She didn't answer at first. She only stared at him with wide eyes, like she didn't know whether to trust kindness anymore. Then she shook her head fast and whispered that she couldn't go back, that she didn't know where to go, that she just needed to breathe. Jacob looked around. A couple of pedestrians passed, uninterested. A man in a suit glanced over and kept walking like compassion would stain his clothes. Jacob swallowed hard. He could leave. He could pretend he didn't see her. Most people would. But Jacob wasn't most people. He offered her his bottled water. He picked up her phone from the gutter and wiped it clean with his sleeve. The screen was cracked but still lit up. He asked if there was someone safe he could call. The girl flinched at the word call, and Jacob realized she was terrified of being found. He softened his voice, told her she didn't have to explain everything, but she shouldn't be alone like this. He suggested a nearby cafe, somewhere warm and public. He promised he would stay with her until she felt safe. She finally spoke, barely audible. Her name was Grace. They walked together, slowly. Jacob kept checking his watch, feeling panic rise in his chest like smoke. 10 minutes now. The interview would start without him. He told himself he could drop her off and run back. But the closer they got to the cafe, the more Grace seemed to fall apart. She clutched her stomach like she was going to be sick. Her steps wobbled, her eyes darted everywhere. And then she stopped, pressed her back against a wall, and slid down like her body couldn't hold her anymore. Jacob realized this wasn't just tears. This was a breakdown, a full-body storm. He knelt beside her and asked if she was having an asthma attack. She shook her head, unable to breathe properly, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Jacob remembered his mother's anxiety episodes, how helpless he'd felt watching her struggle. He knew then that leaving Grace alone, even for 5 minutes, could be dangerous. He called 911. As he spoke to the dispatcher, he saw his future slipping away in real time. The dispatcher asked questions. Jacob answered. Minutes passed. He watched the traffic light change again and again, watched people enter Hartwell Technologies while he sat on the sidewalk holding a stranger's hand to keep her anchored to the world. His phone buzzed with an unknown number, likely the recruiter calling to confirm his arrival, but he couldn't answer. Not while Grace's breathing sounded like it might snap. When the paramedics arrived, they moved with calm urgency, checking her pulse and oxygen levels. Grace kept whispering that she couldn't go back, that she'd rather disappear than return to the place she came from. The paramedic asked Jacob if he was family. Jacob said no, but he wasn't leaving her alone. The paramedic nodded like he'd seen enough of the world to respect that kind of loyalty. A black SUV pulled up behind the ambulance, and then another. Men in dark suits stepped out, scanning the area with the cold alertness of trained security. One of them walked directly toward Grace, speaking into an earpiece. Grace's face turned pale. Her whole body stiffened with terror. Jacob stood instinctively, placing himself between them and the girl. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know who they were. But he knew fear when he saw it, and Grace was drowning in it. The security man demanded to know where Grace had been. His tone wasn't cruel, but it was sharp, controlling. Jacob told him to back up, that she was having a medical episode, that he'd called for help. The man's eyes narrowed, sizing Jacob up like he was an inconvenience. Then the CEO's car arrived. It wasn't flashy. It was expensive in a quiet way, the kind of car that didn't need to show off because it already owned the road. A tall man stepped out, his hair graying at the temples, his face carved with the kind of stress money can't erase. His eyes locked on Grace like the world had been missing a piece and finally found it. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside her, his voice trembling as he called her name. Grace's eyes filled again. She didn't pull away. She looked at him like she was angry and relieved all at once, like she wanted to hate him but couldn't stop needing him. Jacob stepped back, suddenly aware he'd walked into something far bigger than a random crisis on the sidewalk. One of the security men turned to Jacob and asked his name, his tone still suspicious. Jacob gave it. He expected to be thanked and dismissed. Instead, the older man stood and faced Jacob fully, his expression shifting from panic to focus. He asked Jacob what happened. Jacob explained everything. How he found her crying, how she seemed terrified, how he stayed with her, how he called 911. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't ask for credit. He simply told the truth. The older man's eyes softened in a way that startled Jacob. The man extended his hand, gripping Jacob's firmly. He introduced himself as Thomas Hartwell. The name hit Jacob like thunder. Thomas Hartwell was the CEO of Hartwell Technologies, the very building Jacob was supposed to be inside right now, fighting for a job. Jacob's mouth went dry. His eyes flicked to the towering glass doors behind them. He imagined the recruiter checking the time, crossing his name off the list, deciding he wasn't serious enough. He felt the loss like a physical blow. Thomas Hartwell looked at him for a long moment, then asked quietly, almost painfully, what Jacob had been doing outside the building in the first place. Jacob hesitated, embarrassed, then admitted he had an interview. This was his one shot. He'd needed this job more than anything, and he missed it. The wind moved through the street like a whisper. The paramedics helped Grace into the ambulance. Thomas watched her go, his face haunted. Then he looked back at Jacob, and something in his gaze changed, like he wasn't just seeing a stranger anymore, but a young man who had chosen decency over destiny. Thomas asked for the recruiter's name. He asked for Jacob's interview time. He asked for Jacob's phone number. Jacob gave it, not knowing what any of it meant. He only knew he felt empty, like he'd just donated the last piece of hope he had. That afternoon, Jacob returned to his small apartment on the south side. His mother was asleep on the couch, her medication bottles lined neatly on the coffee table. Jacob sat at the kitchen table, staring at his resume folder like it was a relic from a life that almost happened. He told himself he did the right thing, but the right thing didn't pay rent. The right thing didn't cover medical bills. The right thing didn't stop fear from crawling up his throat. That night he went to work at the warehouse. His body moved like a machine, but his mind was somewhere else, replaying the moment he watched his chance walk away. Around midnight his phone rang. He nearly ignored it. Unknown number. He answered. A woman's voice introduced herself as Veronica from Hartwell Technologies. She said Mr. Hartwell had requested an immediate meeting with Jacob the next morning personally. She said transportation would be provided if needed. She said it was urgent. Jacob barely slept. The next day he was brought into the building not through the main entrance, but through a private elevator that opened onto a quiet executive floor. Everything smelled like polished wood and expensive calm. Jacob's hands shook as he waited outside a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. He kept thinking this was a mistake. Maybe Grace had accused him of something. Maybe he'd be blamed for interfering. When the doors opened, Thomas Hartwell stood there alone. He looked different in daylight, less like a headline, more like a father who had almost lost his child. He invited Jacob inside, offered him coffee, but Jacob could barely swallow. Thomas didn't waste time. He told Jacob the truth. Grace was his daughter. She'd been struggling for months with anxiety and pressure. She felt trapped by expectations, watched by security, suffocated by a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt like a cage from the inside. That morning she ran away because she couldn't breathe in her own world anymore. She didn't trust anyone in her circle. She believed they'd drag her back without listening. But Jacob was different. Jacob didn't know who she was. He didn't treat her like a prize or a problem. He treated her like a human being. Thomas admitted with a rawness that humbled Jacob that he had been so busy building an empire that he had missed the cracks forming in his daughter's heart. And when he found her on that sidewalk, shaking and broken, he saw Jacob holding her hand like it was the most important thing in the world. Thomas said that kind of character couldn't be taught. It couldn't be bought. It could only be chosen. Then he slid a folder across the table. Inside was a job offer, not just for the role Jacob interviewed for, but a better one. A paid training program, full benefits, and a salary that made Jacob's breath catch. There was also a letter offering to cover medical assistance resources for Jacob's mother through a company support foundation. Jacob stared at the papers, overwhelmed. He felt his eyes sting. He tried to speak but couldn't. Thomas told him something Jacob would never forget, that opportunities come and go, but integrity is rare. That Jacob had already passed the interview when he chose to help someone who couldn't help him back. That Hartwell Technologies needed people like him, because companies were built by skill, but they were saved by character. Jacob walked out of the building that day with the same suit, the same worn shoes, but a completely different life ahead of him. Not because he demanded anything, not because he manipulated fate, but because he chose kindness when it cost him. Weeks later, Jacob saw Grace again briefly during a company wellness event. She looked healthier, calmer, like someone who had finally been heard. She didn't need to say much for Jacob to understand that his help had mattered. Not as a hero story, but as proof that strangers can be lifelines. And on Jacob's first payday, he went home and placed groceries on the table, paid the overdue bills, and sat beside his mother as she cried quietly into his shoulder. For the first time in years, Jacob didn't feel like he was drowning. He felt like the world had finally loosened its grip. Because sometimes, the moment you think you lost everything is actually the moment you proved who you are. If this story touched your heart even a little, please like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes goodness exists. Your support helps us keep bringing stories that heal and inspire. And before the ending, I have one special request. Comment kindness always returns if you believe one good act can change a life. Jacob never forgot that morning outside the glass doors. He never forgot how close he came to walking away. And he never forgot the quiet truth that changed his destiny. The job was never the real test. The test was the girl on the sidewalk, and Jacob passed with his heart.